Brothers and sisters, let's go on with the seminar. I will try to make this quickly. I have some slides left. But I will try to move quite quickly, just in order to get to the question part. And then if you say you were too quick on that part, I can explain that during the question part, or at the email or whatever. Alright, so we're looking at the Bible, and I think with many issues really, it's important both to have a biblical understanding, but also have the good understanding about the facts in the world, in order to apply the Bible correctly. Because even if we can have biblical morals, if we're convinced, for example, that Sweden is the poorest country in the world, and that all other countries are very rich, then it wouldn't make sense that we would pay, to get more immigrants here. But if we have a more correct picture of the world, then I think it's easier to apply the Bible correctly. So, a refugee, which I mentioned earlier, is usually defined as someone who has been forced to flee the homeland in order to escape persecution due to race, religion, political reasons, other reasons. Sweden has more reasons than that, sexual orientation, gender, and so on. And it's also often applied, but not always, as people fleeing from war, because war are horrible, and that's why people want to escape them. So this is statistics about where the world's refugees come from, and it does not include internally displaced people, that is, persons that are fleeing within their countries, but these are people that flee to other countries. And as you can see, these numbers are from mid-2014 from the UN. Syria, Afghanistan, Somalia, Sudan, both of the Sudans actually, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo are countries that people flee from. Why? Because they're horrible. There's war there, and there's persecution, and it's not very fun to live in those countries. Many people choose to stay there, but many people also choose to flee. Besides being countries with a large part of persecution and war and conflict, these are also countries that are very poor. Afghanistan and DR Congo are some of the poorest countries in the world. So that is understandably also a reason why people want to flee, perhaps to a country where they have a better chance of having a good standard of life and a life that is pleasant. Now, interestingly, most of the world's refugees do not flee to rich countries. In fact, 80%, this doesn't look right, I'm sorry. There's supposed to be a world map underneath. Haven't you seen any statistics? Yeah, you saw that. Alright, I'm sorry for the color transplantation or whatever. In any way, what this map shows is that 80% of refugees move to developing countries. And why is that? Well, it's not primarily because they don't want to go to rich countries, it's because they can't. So if we, for example, take Syria, I'm sure you've all heard about the conflict in Syria. It's really, really horrible. It's one of the deadliest and worst conflicts in modern history. And it has caused a massive humanitarian crisis. So many people want to get away from there. They don't like being trapped in a war between ISIS and a dictator, which I'm sure is quite understandable. So one could think that that's why so many Syrians come to Sweden. They just get here. But it's not that easy as this graph suggests. In fact, it is illegal for Syrian people to go to Sweden or Denmark or France because we do not grant visas to people from these countries where we suspect that they will try to stay. And this is why many people instead first go to Libya, for example, and they take a boat to Italy and they move across the continent to, for example, come to Sweden, which receives a lot of Syrian refugees in particular. In fact, we receive all people coming from Syria. We do not deport people to Syria, which is understandable because there's a war there. Now, you may have heard about these boat trips across the Mediterranean and how many people die. In fact, over 20,000 people have died since 2000. That is the last 50 years. And that's horrible in so many ways. Pope Francis has called it a mass graveyard in the Mediterranean. And the really horrible thing is that we have known this for so long, but nothing has really been done. It's still illegal just to take an airplane ticket, even though airplane tickets are often cheaper than going with these dangerous boats that the traffickers are bringing. So it's a really horrible situation. Now when someone comes to, for example, Sweden, they go to Migrationsverket, our migration board, to seek asylum, and to seek asylum means to apply to stay in that country and be counted as a refugee who has fled from a crisis. As I mentioned, Syrians have a special position in Swedish migration policy because we don't want to deport anyone to Syria. But when it comes to people from other countries, most other countries that is, they are in a process of applying for asylum where they have to bring arguments why they have a legitimate fear of being persecuted or being trapped in a war when they come back home, or if they come back home. And in fact, and not many know this, but 50% of those seeking asylum in Sweden are deported. So 50% are not allowed to stay. And in other countries, for example Denmark, it's even harder to get a permittance to stay. And my eyes opened to this in 2012, as I mentioned earlier. Then I heard about a man called Khaled Kodena, who was from Iraq. He belonged to this religious minority called Yazidi, which you may have heard of. ISIS is persecuting Yazidi a lot and killing them. And Khaled Kodena said that he belongs to this religious minority and that he is persecuted in his home country of Iraq. That's why he fled to Sweden and crossed the Mediterranean and came to Sweden to flee from persecution. The migration board did not believe him though. So they deported him, and tragically in October 2011 he was killed. He actually got his head chopped off. I don't know if it was Al-Qaeda in Iraq, that is ISIS, or if it was another group, but it was very tragic. He had a little son of 2 years that died. And the horrible thing, of course, is that Sweden, as a good, peaceful, friendly society, contributed to this execution. Not willingly, but they surely knew the risks of deporting a person who's saying, yep, if you get me back there, I will die. And that's really the problem with deportations, that many of the Western migration boards assume that so many people are lying, and some of them are, surely. Some just want to escape poverty, but many have a genuine fear of being persecuted. And taking this risk of deporting them is problematic. The same is true for Pastor Jean Kabuidi. Has somebody heard about him? No? He comes from DR Congo. He criticized the government there for being corrupt and for using not legitimate warfare, so to speak, for attacking civilians and so on in the Second Congo War. And eventually he had to flee because he noticed that the security police didn't like his criticism that is provided in his sermons in his church, because he's a pastor. So he came to Sweden, and then he told his story to migration board, and the migration board didn't believe him. And they argued that Kinshasa, which he come from, is safe because it's only in the eastern part of the Congo where there's actual conflict. So they decided to deport him. He tried to run away and become an illegal immigrant, papperslös. But then they arrested him, and they put people into sort of a prison, but it's called storages in Sweden, förvar. So that's where you put migrants or people that ought to be deported that haven't complied or cooperated, and eventually he was deported in February 2012. Now I immediately got involved in this. Pastor Sean is pastor in Folkungakyrkan in Stockholm, where Stefan Svärd is also working. And as I knew Stefan Svärd, I read about this on his blog, and I became involved in trying to get him back. And we did succeed. So we got him back in May 2012. Hallelujah. And that was because it is much easier to come as an immigrant when you apply for a job rather than when you apply for asylum. So his old church applied, we want a Congolese pastor that has these qualifications. And amazingly, Pastor Sean got the job. Now the tragic part, as you can see on the picture, was that less than 24 hours after he arrived in Kinshasa, he was indeed being captured by the security police, and he was tortured for his criticism of the regime, which is exactly what he had been telling the migration board that he feared. That they believed that he was exaggerating or lied or so on, and then he had to deal with the migration policies the hard way. And Sweden actually has been tried in the UN Committee Against Torture, and has been found over 12 times to have actually deported people who have been tortured. So again, this is the risk that we're taking, and it's on. Yes, and that's not very good. Now here's two women, Amira and Zainab. They come from Iran. This is Iran. Hello. And they came to Sweden and became Christians here. So they joined a church, and Ingmar Olsson, who is a good musician, was their pastor. Now, they also didn't get asylum, but they were to be deported. And they protested because they said, now we're Christians, and Christians aren't treated very well in Iran. And they feared greatly that they would actually suffer from persecution there. But the migration board had a test where they had to answer some questions to see if they were really Christian, and they couldn't answer what the Pope names was, and so on. The migration board decided that they weren't Christian. Now, to make a long story short, and you can read about this on the internet, there were European politicians involved in this, Cecilia Wikström and others who fought for their case. But they managed to stay in Sweden, not because primarily of the migration board, but because Lufthansa, the air travel company, decided not to deport them because they didn't want to cooperate with deportations, and they took this decision when they were in Frankfurt about to enter the plane to Tehran. But then they had to go back to Sweden, and then after a while migration board thought a little while, and then they changed their mind, so they let them stay. Now, the reason I'm bringing these testimonies up is to ask the relevant question: who would Jesus deport? WWJD. Because yeah, exactly. Because deportations are it is a very, very beautiful thing. It's a reason that we talk about limit immigration or decrease immigration rather to increase deportations, which is the same thing, because that's the implication. People will still show up here somehow, but if you want to limit immigration, what you're doing is that you forcefully kick people away. And at the current state, even in Sweden, which is the most generous country in Europe, when it comes to receiving immigrants, we have these cases of people being deported to very horrible circumstances. And what really scares me is when even Christians argue that we must now increase deportations even more, because that will inevitably mean that we actually transport people to persecution and war. And this is something, for example, the Sweden Democrats, which I have studied a lot, is very open with. They want to deport people to Syria in the current situation. And of course, that means literally to deport people to war. Now, I can't find a moral reason when it's reasonable to deport someone to a war. Perhaps it would make more sense to deport Norwegians, because you don't have a war there. Yeah, you can go there. I can go with you. No, seriously. And that's also what's really chilling. There is already some sort of free migration within the European Union, which we use and we benefit from. But it's a bit of hypocrisy that it is very, very hard for poor people to enter Europe. But it's very easy for European people not just to move inside Europe, but to move basically everywhere. So I think this is also an important thing when thinking about the social teaching of Christ. How should we view deportations? How is it really compatible with loving everyone as ourselves, with loving immigrants as ourselves, with treating everyone as we would have them treat us, doing this? Now, let's enter part 3 with this wonderful snake. Is hospitality possible? Now I would deal with some arguments which aren't really, they don't originate in the Bible, but they are often used also by Christians who oppose migration, basically lending them from the secular anti-migration movement. Now, a very popular argument is that we should use aid instead of immigration, that it is better to help refugees with supporting refugee camps. in the close by area where they live. And I'm sure that many of you have heard about this. There's been a lot of discussion about this in Sweden, also in Norway I know, and I'm certain in other countries as well that receive immigrants. So the argument basically goes that aid is cheaper than immigration. One can help more refugees through aid than through granting them asylum. So therefore we should give more money to UNHCR instead of receiving so many refugees. It's basically, in terms of efficiency, we can help many more people giving them aid instead of immigration. Now aid is something that I like. I am a student of Peace and Development Studies, as I've already mentioned. I've been reading and studying a lot about aid, and I'm a huge supporter of aid. I think that aid is really, really good. I think the church should give more aid. I think that individuals should give more aid, and I think the state should give more aid. You know, we shouldn't limit ourselves to 1% of our income and keep 99% of ourselves. I think we should increase it even more. And I definitely know that refugee camps are underfinanced, and that the UNHCR needs more money together with other agencies working with these issues. There were actually reports a couple of years ago about refugees coming to a refugee camp in Jordan, and they found themselves in so horrible conditions. Their food was crap, and their tent was crap, and it was all miserable. So they actually moved back into the war in Syria, which is disastrous. And they knew what they were doing, but it was just so horrible. So I definitely think that we should give more aid, but I think that we're putting two good things against each other here, aren't we? Now, here are some of my objections to this argument. It's partly true that it's cheaper with helping, for example, buying food in Jordan is cheaper than in Sweden because of the different strengths of currencies. Often this argument is exaggerated though. I've heard that, you know, for helping one Swedish immigrant, one could give food to 1,000 or 5,000 refugees in a refugee camp, but then you're measuring two different things, because helping an asylum seeker here in Sweden does not just include food, it includes a lot. Also, the problems with this, thinking of aid being something that you actually give away, but when an immigrant comes and eventually starts to work, you can get some money back. Now, I'm not saying that it's a bad thing that we give money away, because, you know, we have got a lot to get rid of. But still, it is exaggerated to say that it's cheaper in some ways. For some individuals, I think it's more expensive to give aid rather to let them come here. Now, another great problem with this is that it's not really being put in practice. If we take the Sweden Democrats again, hallelujah, I've noticed that they talk a lot about this. It's really a mantra of theirs to support UNHCR and other aid agencies rather than to receive immigrants, and they even call themselves the most refugee-friendly party in Sweden. Now, the problem is that the Sweden Democrats are the only party that actually want to decrease aid levels from 1% of the gross national income to 0.7%. So they're not doing this. It's just rhetoric. But even when we look at other countries that receive less immigrants, it's very seldom that they also give more aid. I'm thinking, for example, for Denmark and other countries. Hungary, for example, that now is basically cancelling their immigration. They're not this huge development partner. So it's not being really put in practice. Also, on a theoretical level, refugee camps, I think, inevitably provide less security and life standards than asylum does. And that does not mean that refugee camps are not good and that we should not invest in them. But it is quite inevitable when building a refugee camp from nothing, you will have less services there. And you will have less protection there. It's closer to the actual conflict. In some cases, conflict has actually spread on to refugee camps, so that refugees have to flee once again, and so on. Some refugee camps has been developed into towns, basically. There are some in Kenya and some in Palestine and so on. Yeah, in general, these entities are not equal. It's not like we can give an asylum seeker the exact same standard of living in a refugee camp than we give here in Sweden. Fact is that we don't. It's upholding inequality, I would say. This argument is basically based upon that we need to protect Western wealth, which I don't think we should, because the problem is that other countries are poor. The problem is not that Sweden and Denmark and Norway are poor. It's not helping the same people. So we cannot really defend deportations with, yeah, well, we'll give aid to someone else down there. You know, we should treat everyone as individual human beings with dignity. And then I don't think it's reasonable to deport someone to a war and saying, yeah, but you know, we provided some aid for a camp in a country nearby. It's also breeding unemployment, and not many know this, but in most refugee camps, people don't work. And that's yet another reason why it's not really, if you look at on a global scale, it's not really cheaper. Because since people don't work in refugee camps, it's basically, you know, providing welfare and benefits, which, you know, isn't really a bad thing, but it surely isn't cheaper than actually receiving immigrants and letting them work here. And I also think that even if one invests in this, it should be used beforehand and not afterhand, that it should make deportation unnecessary. I would love if we increase our aid giving and stop all the refugee crisis, that nobody has to flee and all refugees are provided what they need in refugee camps. And that would be awesome, but we're not there yet, and so we cannot really increase deportation using this argument. Furthermore, this aid versus immigration argument, I think, is quite new, at least here in Sweden. What has mostly been used in the xenophobic community is putting immigration against welfare for natives. And this is a commercial for the Sweden Democrats when there was a flood of Muslim women with their babies, and they were running towards a broms, to stop pensions and elderly care. And then there was a single elderly lady trying to stop immigration, and the message was that this is the struggle. You know, we don't have endless amount of money in Sweden. We have to choose: should we invest in our elderly natives, or should we invest in the immigrants? And you can guess what they thought that we should do. Now, there are some people missing from this equation. For example, rich people. And don't get me wrong, I'm not a communist or a socialist. I'm just a Christian. And as I mentioned previously, I think that, you know, the Bible is quite clear that there's a problem with hoarding large amounts of wealth for oneself. We've already looked at Jesus' teaching, and I've written James' teaching there in the right about rich people. And it's very critical to them, claim that, you know, they live in luxury and hoarding wealth for themselves while they oppress poor people, and poor people are starving. In Sweden, we have 147 billionaires, at least we have when this article was written a couple of years ago. And together they own 1.2 trillion kronor, which is equivalent to a quarter of the Swedish GDP. Well, that's a lot of money. And you know, one time I was talking with a Christian Sweden Democrat, and he talked about, you know, how our welfare system is destroyed, and our elderly people don't get anything, and you know, it's just the immigrants getting everything, because obviously immigrants are the richest people in Sweden. And then I asked him about these 147 billionaires. What do you think about them? You know, because he obviously saw a conflict, you know, a struggle with getting the money. But he said, no, they worked hard for the money. You know, I'm not a communist. And many people, I think, are blind for this. If we really put people against each other, should we really put the poorest people in a society against each other? What about the rich? And then, furthermore, of course, our nations as a whole are very rich. Now, the colors aren't viewed correctly again, but in the right corner, this is from Hans Rosling Gapminder. This is Sweden and Norway and Denmark. They are clumping around like little baby boys. They are very rich. Norway is even one of the richest countries in the world. And Sweden is in the top 20 league, top 10 if you remove all the small city-states. I don't know if you can see this, but this graph says that, for example, Sweden is 4 times as rich as Romania, it is 10 times as rich as Syria, and it is 100 times richer than the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So again, this is the global inequality that we have to keep in mind. Sweden and Norway and Denmark aren't the victims here. We have a lot of money. And when poor people come from poor countries to rich countries, you know, it becomes very bizarre and strange to say, oh no, we're getting poor, get out of here. You know, if we view immigrants as this cost, intrinsic cost, which is problematic in itself, but if we view all immigrants, yeah, they're a burden, And what we're basically saying is this burden should be placed on this 80% of countries that receive immigrants and that are developing countries. And that is why I think that this xenophobic logic is basically protecting Western wealth and protecting the poverty of the rest of the world. Now, there's a debate about the cost of immigration, whether it is a cost or not. I've been reading a little bit in Jan Tullberg's book Låsningen, that was Swedish, and he talked about how Swedish immigration is a huge cost. He supports the Sweden Democrats. He thinks that the cost is 250 billion kronor every year. And on the contrary spectrum, a leftist think tank just recently provided a report saying that no, it has actually benefited Swedish society with 900 billions during the last 50 years. Obviously, these don't agree with each other. I've been trying to get into the arguments and so on. I don't want to bore you with it too much and the time is running out. Basically, one huge problem with Jan Tullberg is that he's saying that half of this cost, 250 billion kronor every year, is because they take our jobs. So besides criticizing immigrants for living on welfare and taking benefits and grants and all that, he's also doubling his imaginary sum of what immigration costs, because he believes that every time an immigrant gets a job, a Swedish person could have got that job instead. And that's a cost for Swedish society. Now that's ridiculous. Because, you know, then we could say that all people from Skåne are taking our jobs, and that all people from Skåne, whatever they do, are a cost to society, because that's really this implication. No matter if an immigrant is working or living on welfare, they're a cost to Swedish society. And that's just crap. I don't buy that. You know, if we look at America, it was a real miracle if immigration really always is a huge cost to society, because you probably know America was based on immigration, not in a very good way because it was colonialism, but it's hard to deny that they migrated really, really fast and that they now is the richest country in the world. So for example, between 1800 and 1900, the population grew from 5 million people to 75 million, which is an increase 15 times. That's a lot. And again, it's not just good, you know, 10 million of those were slaves from primarily Africa, but it was also built on free migration from Europe. 1 million Swedes went to the USA to escape the horrible conservative states of Sweden that didn't allow freedom of religion. So I think it's ridiculous to say that immigration always is a cost to society. Basically, economic growth is produced either by technological innovation or population growth, and immigration by definition is always population growth. And moving on, what about ISIS? Now we're getting close to the end. ISIS is horrible. ISIS is really horrible. One Christian Sweden Democrat, he wrote on Facebook about me a month ago. He said that I'm a false prophet and I'm a terrible person. And he's saying that, you know, people like me ignore the humanitarian crisis in Iraq, for example, where Christians are beheaded, and so on. And of course, I've never done that. On the opposite, I've talked a lot about these crises in general, and specifically, of course, when my Christian brothers and sisters are persecuted. So the difference between me and people who are against immigration is not that somebody of us think that this is wonderful. The difference is, what do we do with it? Basically, many people against immigration and that are against Islam, on not just on an ideological level, but also on a political level, so to speak, they are basically viewing that the war is going on. I spoke to a Christian Sweden Democrat who is convinced that Christians are going to be eliminated in Sweden in a couple of decades because of the Muslim immigration. Eventually they will commit genocide on the Christian population. So it's this clash of civilizations, and of course that makes people fear. Of course people don't like ISIS, are afraid of ISIS and other terror groups, and fear that they will infiltrate our society. In the report in Sweden, it has been revealed that 300 people have left Sweden to go and fight for ISIS. So that's really horrible. But I think we need to go back to the Great Commission when dealing with this problem and think about, is it really our mission to take over a country and make it Christian, put a nice cross on the flag, and then deport people of other faiths to get rid of the problems with that. I mean, Sweden and Norway and Denmark, I would say, aren't a Christian nation in that, you know, the majority of the population is Christian. They have a Christian heritage based, you know, and it's also a bit problematic because it wasn't based on freedom of religion, but it was based because people had to be Christian. But then the current situation is that most people do not believe in Jesus. 85% of the members of the Church of Sweden say that they don't believe in Jesus. And then our job is, of course, to evangelize, to preach repentance and to preach salvation. And that is really what is going to spread the gospel rather than deportations. I would say that to spread the gospel on the streets, like we do here with the Pancake Church, is better evangelism than deporting Muslims fearing that they would take over the country. Even if they would take over the country in some bizarre scenario in the future, I think that, again, it's not a relevant thing for Christians to do to actively support deportations to war. Because our job is always to love and is always to share the gospel. And if we want to make our nations Christian by deportations, I think we should start with the atheists. You know, deport Christians to Greenland or somewhere. You know, it becomes pretty ridiculous. You know, I think it is possible that our nations will change, that there will be a greater mixture in the future when it comes to ethnicity and religion and so on. But our job as Christians is always to preach the gospel. No matter if we're majority or minority, no matter how the situation looks like. And I'm very disturbed that it is a relevant alternative to so many Christians to deport people back to war. I mean, what's going to stop ISIS? We can discuss a long night about what's going to stop ISIS, military action, humanitarian action, and so on. What's not going to stop ISIS is A, deporting ISIS victims back to ISIS, and B, deporting ISIS to ISIS. Because that's ridiculous. I mean, that's like during the Second World War to deport both Jews and Nazis to Nazi Germany. It's not a good combination. So really, I'm much more pro to imprison people that had be fighting for ISIS rather than to deport them to where they can go on with their killing. Finally, xenophobia, främlingsfientlighet, is really a phobia. Is being afraid of the strangers, being afraid of the terror. And this is, you know, as you know, what Anders Behring Breivik, he was convinced about this war, the clash of civilizations between Muslims and Christians. He saw himself as Christian, even though I wouldn't say he was, and did this horrible thing on Utaya. And I think in order to change this, both the horrible views of radical Islamists, both the horrible views of radical racists, we need love. All you need is love. Right? So John says, God is love, whoever lives in love lives in God, and God in them. This is how love is made complete among us, so that we will have confidence on the day of judgment. In this world we are like Jesus, there is no fear in love. Perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. That's why I don't think we should be xenophobic, and that I think we should love immigrants. Thank you for listening.